Dawn, June 3, 1864. A thin gray light creeps over the fields east of Richmond. Thousands of Union soldiers crouch in the dew-soaked grass and tangled underbrush, rifles gripped tight, waiting for the signal. Some of them have already done something quietly heartbreaking. They've pinned scraps of paper to their uniforms, names, hometowns, next of kin, because they don't expect to come back in one piece. One man's diary, recovered later from a blood-soaked coat, carries a single entry for that day. June 3rd, Cold Harbor. I was killed. A few miles away, in a modest headquarters tent, Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant sits with his staff. Maps are spread out. Coffee steams in tin cups. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke and unwashed wool. Grant knows exactly what he's about to order. He knows the Confederate lines in front of him are no ordinary breastworks. They are 7 miles of freshly dug trenches, rifle pits, and artillery emplacements, strengthened overnight by men who have been fighting and marching for a month straight. He knows his own troops are exhausted, their uniforms ragged, their confidence frayed after 30 days of almost continuous combat. He knows the ground ahead is open in places, swampy in others, swept by interlocking fields of fire. And still, at 4:30 that morning, the assault goes forward. To understand why Grant gave that order, and why he lived with the regret for the rest of his life, we have to go back to the beginning of the Overland Campaign, back to the moment when the quiet, unassuming man from Ohio took command of all Union armies and set out to do what no one before him had managed: destroy Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. When Grant crossed the Rapidan River on May 4, 1864, he carried something new into the Eastern Theater: a simple, brutal plan. Lee's army was the objective, not Richmond, not ground, the army itself. Grant intended to keep hitting it day after day until it could no longer fight. He had the numbers, roughly 118,000 men against Lee's 64,000, and he had the political backing of a president who was tired of generals who retreated after every bloody nose. Lincoln wanted a fighter. He got one. The first test came in the wilderness, those tangled, second-growth woods where visibility dropped to 20 yards and smoke hung like fog. The fighting was savage. Grant lost nearly 18,000 men in 2 days. Lee lost about 11,000. But when the smoke cleared on May 7th, something unprecedented happened. Instead of pulling back across the river like every Union commander before him, Grant turned his columns south. The men in the ranks noticed. One soldier wrote home, "We are going to Richmond, and we are going to stay there." For the first time, the Army of the Potomac sensed it had a commander who measured victory not by who held the field at nightfall, but by who was still standing at the end of the campaign. Spotsylvania Courthouse followed. There, on May 12th, the fighting reached a new level of horror at a place the soldiers called the Bloody Angle. Men fought hand-to-hand for 20 hours in pouring rain, using bayonets, clubbed muskets, and even fists. The dead piled so high that living soldiers had to climb over them to keep firing. Grant lost another 18,000. Lee lost perhaps 13,000. Again, Grant refused to retreat. He slid east, then south, always trying to get around Lee's right flank. By late May, at the North Anna River, Lee tried something clever. He built a V-shaped line of entrenchments that looked inviting. If Grant attacked the center, Lee could smash both Union wings. Grant saw the trap and refused to spring it. Instead, he slipped away again, marching southeast toward the crossroads village of Cold Harbor. Lee, short on men and shorter on time, raced to meet him. By May 31st, both armies were converging on Cold Harbor, a place named for a tavern that offered cold rooms but no hot meals, an ironic footnote for what was coming. Union cavalry under Philip Sheridan seized the intersection first, then held it against furious counterattacks until infantry could arrive. On June 1st, Wright's 6th Corps and Smith's 18th Corps, fresh troops pulled from the Army of the James, slammed into the Confederate line. They carried the first line of rifle pits and took hundreds of prisoners, but the cost was high. Still, Grant's optimism held. In a letter to Henry Halleck in Washington just days earlier, he had written, "Lee's army is really whipped. I may be mistaken, but I feel that our success over Lee's army is already assured." That sentence tells you everything about what Grant knew and what he chose to believe. He knew Lee's army had been bled white. He knew the Confederates were down to roughly 50,000 effectives, many of them barefoot, many of them boys and old men. He knew they were fighting on the defensive, pinned against the Chickahominy River with their backs to Richmond. What Grant did not fully appreciate, or chose not to dwell on, was how deeply they had dug in. Overnight on June 1st and 2nd, Lee's men turned a makeshift line into a fortress. They felled trees, piled dirt, sharpened stakes. They sighted artillery to rake every approach. And Grant's own corps commanders, Hancock, Wright, Smith, had not been given time or orders to conduct thorough reconnaissance. The attack was set for the afternoon of June 2nd, then postponed because Hancock's Second Corps got lost in the dark and arrived exhausted. That delay gave Lee's engineers another full night to perfect their defenses. Grant knew all of this. He had ridden the lines himself. He had read the reports. He had seen the same kind of works at Spotsylvania, and his men had carried them anyway. He believed that relentless pressure, coordinated assaults, and sheer weight of numbers would finally crack the Confederate shell. He also knew the political clock was ticking. The presidential election was 5 months away. Northern newspapers were already calling the campaign a butcher's bill. If he paused now, if he let Lee rest and regroup, the war might drag into another year. So, on the night of June 2, he gave the order, attack at first light. The assault began precisely at 4:30 a.m. on June 3. 3 Union Corps, Hancock on the left, Wright in the center, Smith on the right, stepped off almost simultaneously. No grand plan, no elaborate coordination. Just 3 separate hammer blows meant to overwhelm the line at multiple points. Hancock's men, veterans of the Bloody Angle, charged through thickets and swamps. Barlow's division hit hard, overran Breckinridge's Confederates, captured 3 guns and several hundred prisoners. For a few minutes, it looked like a breakthrough. Then, Confederate artillery and reserves slammed the door shut. Gibbon's division bogged down in ravines and took murderous crossfire. Wright's Sixth Corps carried the outer rifle pits, but could go no farther. Smith's 18th Corps, advancing across open ground, walked straight into a storm of canister and musketry. One Confederate officer later said the Federal dead lay so thick in front of his position that you could have walked from one end of the line to the other without touching the ground. By 7:30, the fighting was essentially over. The Union had gained almost nothing. In roughly 1 hour, some accounts say the worst of it lasted only 10 minutes, nearly 7,000 Union soldiers fell. Confederate losses were a fraction of that, perhaps 1,500. The survivors dug in where they lay, sometimes using the bodies of their comrades for cover. The lines were so close in places that men could hear the enemy breathing. Grant rode forward around 11 o'clock to talk with his corps commanders. Hancock said the enemy was too strong in his front. Wright thought a coordinated push with support might work. Smith was openly pessimistic. Grant listened, then wrote a short note to Meade at 12:30 p.m. The opinion of corps commanders not being sanguine of success in case an assault is ordered, you may direct a suspension of further advance for the present. The order to stop was almost an afterthought. The damage was already done. That afternoon, Grant sent a dispatch to Washington that still makes for painful reading. We assaulted at 4:30 this a.m., driving the enemy within his entrenchments at all points, but without gaining a decided advantage. Our loss was not severe, nor do I suppose the enemy lost heavily. He had just watched the worst single-day slaughter of his career and still downplayed it. Later in his memoirs, he would write the sentence that has defined his reputation ever since. "I have always regretted that the last assault at Cold Harbor was ever made. No advantage whatever was gained to compensate for the heavy loss we sustained." He regretted it more than the failed assault at Vicksburg the year before. He regretted it more than the Wilderness, more than Spotsylvania. Why? Because at Cold Harbor, there was no compensating strategic gain on the field itself. The ground gained was worthless. The Confederate army was not broken, and thousands of young men had been fed into a meat grinder for nothing. For the next 3 days, the two armies glared at each other across no man's land, while the wounded screamed in the sun. Grant and Lee haggled over a truce. Grant wanted unarmed litter parties to go out without formal flags. Lee insisted on the proper courtesies of a flag of truce. The delay was agonizing. By the time the details were worked out on June 7th, most of the wounded who could have been saved were dead. One Union officer remembered the sound of those cries carrying on the wind for days. It was the kind of scene that turned public opinion in the North against Grant for a time. Newspapers called him the Butcher. Soldiers pinned more notes to their coats before the next fight, just in case. And yet, for all the horror, Cold Harbor was not the end of the story. Grant had kept Lee pinned in place for 12 days. While the two armies clawed at each other, he was already thinking ahead. On June 12th, under cover of darkness and deception, he pulled the entire Army of the Potomac out of its trenches, crossed the James River on a pontoon bridge more than 2,000 feet long, and marched toward Petersburg. Lee, expecting another fight at Cold Harbor, was caught flat-footed. The move to Petersburg, the real objective all along, began the siege that would finally strangle the Confederacy. Grant never tried to excuse Cold Harbor. He owned it. In his memoirs, he laid the facts bare without self-pity. He had known the risks. He had known the fortifications. He had known his men were tired. He had known Lee's army was still dangerous. But he had also known that the only way to win the war was to keep fighting, keep moving, keep bleeding the enemy until the Confederacy ran out of blood. In that narrow, terrible sense, the assault at Cold Harbor was consistent with everything Grant believed about modern war. It was attrition on a grand scale. It was the price he was willing to pay so that later, at Petersburg and Appomattox, the price would not have to be paid again. The men who survived Cold Harbor carried the memory differently. One private wrote years later that the assault taught him something about command. Even the best generals sometimes ask the impossible of ordinary men. Another, from a New York regiment, said simply, "We went in expecting to die, and most of us did." Their sacrifice did not win the day at Cold Harbor, but it helped win the war, because Grant, for all his regret, never stopped. He absorbed the lesson, adjusted, and kept the pressure on until the Confederacy had nothing left to give. That is what Grant knew before Cold Harbor. He knew the cost, he knew the ground, he knew the odds, and he still gave the order, because in the spring of 1864, stopping was no longer an option. The war had to end, and Ulysses S. Grant had decided it would end on his terms, no matter what it took.